Today we gather to focus on the Bay's future and inspire one another to create a Bay that is resilient in the face of climate change. The threats of climate change are complex and require us to expand our focus to include social issues as well as environmental issues. They are inextricably linked. While looking forward and preparing for the future, Save the Bay has also been looking back at our own 60-year legacy, our country's history, and the role we've played in upholding systems of oppression. Many influential conservationists promoted racist ideals, and conservationism led the way for the modern environmental movement, which originally excluded women, Black, indigenous, people of color, and those of low socioeconomic status. In educating ourselves and striving to unlearn harmful practices that contribute to oppression and exclusion, we are learning ways to take steps towards equity and environmental justice. One of those learnings is the practice of a land acknowledgement, and we would like to share that with you today. Land acknowledgement is a traditional custom that dates back centuries in many indigenous communities. Today, land acknowledgements are used by Native and non-Native people to formally recognize and honor the indigenous peoples as traditional stewards of the land. Save the Bay does not work with any indigenous groups and understands that we can improve by forging these relationships intentionally. In this moment, this is the first step in addressing our shortcomings, and we welcome any input as we continue learning. Today, we gather on the ancestral and unceded land of the Ohlone people. For thousands of years, the Ohlone were the caretakers of this land until the oppressive forces of colonialism and white supremacy forced many of them from their homes. As individuals with varying levels of privilege, we acknowledge that we have benefited and continue to benefit from the unjust removal and genocide of the Ohlone people. It is precisely because of their labor, resistance, and dedication to this magnificent land that we are able to enjoy this place we call home. It is important that we also recognize that the Muwekma Ohlone tribe is alive and flourishing today and are still fighting for federal recognition in our country. This land continues to be of deep importance to the Ohlone people and their descendants. There is still much work to be done to bring to light all the past and present injustices. Each of us must acknowledge and take part in rectifying the damage and exploitation of the environment and its original inhabitants, which was and continues to be perpetuated by colonialism and capitalism. We are committed to advancing equity and inclusion, and though this is a small step, we hope it creates awareness and the opportunity for reflection about social issues that continue to affect our communities today.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to 60 Years Strong, a celebration of Save the Bay and this beautiful place we get to call home. I'm Wendy Takuda, and I'm honored to be your host. Today, we're going to hear from some environmental experts to tell us how climate change is going to affect all of us. We'll find out what we can do to fight the worst effects and become more resilient. And we're going to celebrate a birthday. This year marks the 60th anniversary of Save the Bay. And while we can't share any birthday cake with you, we can share stories of hope and learn how we can make a difference. First, a little bit about the path that brought me here. I spent more than 35 years in television news, but the natural world called to me a lot earlier than that. I got my environmental education growing up on the shores of Puget Sound, the daughter of a fisherman. He taught me what he learned growing up in a tiny sawmill town called Mukilteo, no joke. We would go into the forest around Seattle, picking blackberries in the summer, mushrooms in the spring and the fall, and every summer vacation we spent on Puget Sound, tide pooling, clam digging, hanging out on the beach while Dad went fishing. The first house I bought was on San Francisco Bay, literally. It was a small houseboat in Sausalito. Now I live upstream in the Sauso Creek watershed in Oakland. I volunteer doing environmental restoration work, and I see climate change happening right in front of my eyes. Even before COVID, we had to wear masks because of the smoke. Sea level is rising. A drought is upon us. And we all remember the day last year when the entire sky turned dark orange, blocking out the sun. It was apocalyptic. We're here today to talk about what we can do about that. For 60 years, Save the Bay has been doing some of the most important environmental work in the Bay Area. And it all started with 3 ordinary women who decided to do something. To tell us more about them and this organization, I turn the reins over now to a friend of mine and a relentless environmental advocate, Doug McConnell. You may know Doug from his Open Road series, and before that, Bay Area Backroads. Let's watch.
The Bay Area is the epicenter of urban conservation, innovation, and success anywhere in the nation, and maybe the world. And one of the greatest legacies of conservation success has been carved by a dedicated nonprofit organization founded 60 years ago. Well, its urgent mission was, and still is, in many ways, embedded in its very name: Save the Bay.
6 decades ago, San Francisco Bay was threatened with extinction. 90% of its wetlands had been destroyed. Its bayshore was in many places a wasteland of dumps and debris, allowing virtually no public access to the water's edge, and the water itself was a noxious mess. Plans were afoot to fill in what remained of the bay, leaving only a sorry river in its wake. 3 extraordinary women watched from a window in a home in the East Bay Hills.
When you look out the window from Kay Kerr's house, you can't imagine, what this would look like. And I'm sure, they were mortified when they thought about that.
Sylvia McLaughlin, Kay Kerr, and Esther Gulick were mortified and motivated to save the bay. They were genteel, but they were determined.
These were the networkers, par excellence. They knew how to get people motivated. So lovely.
Motivated and inspired.
Right.
With thousands of people joining for $1 and rallying to the cause, Save the Bay was born, and the organization deftly turned the tide of ruin in the direction of rebirth.
I think that they would be proud of the way that this turned out, but there are many actors who help with that.
Save the Bay's 60-year success story has been the product of many concerned people committing themselves to the Bay's future and their own, educating young people, revegetating the Bay's shoreline, advocating for policies to enhance the health of the Bay, and leading the effort to pass Measure AA region-wide in 2016 to begin restoring 100,000 acres of tidal wetlands in 9 counties all around the Bay. With climate change and rising seas rushing our way, we all have to save the Bay once more. A new generation of leaders is showing the way.
Saving the Bay is really about saving the Bay Area, all right, and the communities and all the people who live in the Bay Area, and how we can be incredibly mindful of the environmental justice work that we do, and really just being able to provide access to all people to access the Bay.
Save the Bay's mission for the next 60 years and beyond is to create a cleaner, greener, and healthier Bay and Bay Area community for everyone. Juliana Park came to this work when her young daughter, Sasha, sought to spend time with her mom and save the Bay, caring for the Bay's nature, and that transformed both their lives.
Hopefully she'll be able to say that our generation did everything we could, right? And that we actually did get involved to be able to leave a better planet for them.
3 visionary women helped give us a better Bay Area. Now it's our turn to pay it forward.
What if I told you that 20,000 years ago, San Francisco Bay did not exist? This was the time of the Ice Age, where glaciers covered the Earth's mountains, ice caps extended from the poles down and across North America, and sea levels were much lower than they are today. Instead of a bay, a great river flowed through a valley that extended over 20 miles west of the current shoreline. This means that 20,000 years ago during low tide, you could walk all the way to the Farallon Islands from the Golden Gate.
So that was the Bay Area in the past. And now it's time to hear from some experts on the future of San Francisco Bay and the challenges of climate change. We have two panels. The first one will focus on the water and the shoreline along the bay. And the second one will take us inland and upstream. Our moderator today is David Lewis, who is the executive director of Save the Bay. David has led this organization for 23 years. He's considered one of the top advocates for San Francisco Bay. Let's hear now from David and our first panel.
Well, good morning, and thank you for joining me outside on this beautiful day to talk about opportunities and risks on the shoreline from climate change. I'm David Lewis, the executive director at Save the Bay, and I have two experts with me to talk about this topic. Donna, could you introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Donna Ball. I'm the lead scientist for the South Bay Salt Pond Restoration Project, as well as a senior scientist at San Francisco Estuary Institute.
I'm Jessie Olson. I'm the Associate Director of Native Plant Nurseries at Save the Bay. I have a background in natural resource management.
So climate change is already affecting the Bay Area in many ways that we can't ignore anymore. Wildfires and the smoke that are affecting our breathing and public health, more extreme storms that are bringing rain and flooding, now again an extreme drought, and many other impacts. These are all affecting public health and wildlife here in the Bay Area, both in the Bay and in the communities around the Bay. So I thought I'd start this morning by just asking you to summarize some of the impacts that we're seeing already and the threats from sea level rise. Why is sea level rise such a big threat in the Bay Area? Donna?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of people don't recognize it, but we are seeing a lot of threats from sea level rise right now. Sea level rise has increased over the past few years in general. I think people maybe can get a sense of what that might look like or what it looks like when they think of king tides. King tides occur periodically in the Bay, and they have an impact on both our roads as well as some of our habitats that we think of as important and other infrastructure.
And so the tides in the Bay really mean that sea level rise, sea level's not level, right? So how do the tides influence what's going on the shoreline?
Well, we have daily tides that are both high and low. And during the highest tides, you can look out over the marsh and you see that the vegetation is mostly covered. And it beats up right against the edge of the shoreline. And during low tides, you can look out and see a lot of mudflat. I think we can expect to see more of the high tides as we face sea level rise in the future. And that's important because a lot of our infrastructure and our houses and a lot of people live near the edge of the shoreline. And as those tides rise, those areas will be affected and threatened in the future.
Yeah, so a lot of the Bay shoreline is really altered, and we still have these areas of tidal marsh. Jessie, maybe you could explain a little bit why tidal marsh is so important and just how it works.
Sure. So, the Bay Area is a highly urbanized estuary, but not everything along the shoreline is developed. We still have beautiful swaths of remnant tidal mudflat and tidal marsh. These are areas that are worth restoring and protecting, and we have a lot of opportunities to build out even more tidal marsh and restore them. They provide a lot of benefits, not just to us in shoreline protection and protection from sea level rise, but they also provide habitat for a lot of endangered and endemic animal species. They also prevent pollution from hedging out into the bay. They can pull microplastics out before it goes out into the ocean. They can also pull out chemicals and pollutants like that. And we have a lot of opportunity to continue that work of restoring and protecting tidal marsh and tidal mudflats.
Yeah, you both have been working on restoring tidal marsh, but maybe explain a little bit about what process is that? How does that actually happen? How have we been able to restore tidal marshes where they might have existed before, but then were destroyed?
Well, historically, there were more extensive tidal marshes than we currently have, and over 90% of those have been lost over time. But a bulk of those in the Bay were converted over the last 100 and 150 years to commercial salt ponds. And those ponds have now been returned, a good portion of those have now been returned to the public ownership. And so we've been able to actually restore some of those salt ponds to tidal marshes by doing things like just removing levees or doing some construction to raise the elevation of those ponds so that they could become tidal marshes easier. So I'm on a project right now where over 15,000 acres are being restored in the South San Francisco Bay.
So if you remove a levee, then how does the tidal marsh get restored? How does it regenerate?
Yeah, it's not as simple of a process as just removing the levee. In a lot of cases, the land in these salt ponds has subsided. And so if you were to remove a levee and let the tide back in, a tidal marsh wouldn't necessarily be able to establish. And so it's part of a much bigger process in which sediment needs to be brought in to bring the tidal marsh up to the correct elevation. Donna briefly mentioned this. And once that elevation is met, then the tidal marsh can reestablish itself. It's actually a very expensive and long process. And SFEI, who Donna works for, just released a report called Sediments for Survival, which is looking at the way that we could reuse sediment to help benefit these large-scale tidal marsh projects.
Yeah, and what's really important that was noted in that is that we currently, looking towards the future, we don't have enough sediment to restore all the marshes that we hope to restore. There are sources of sediment that we could use. For example, the Corps actually takes a lot of sediment that we use to dredge our ports and our harbors and dumps it out into the Pacific Ocean. And if we could reuse some of that sediment, that would help with the restoration of some of these projects.
Yeah, so there are approximately 30,000 acres of land that are set aside for restoration for tidal marsh, but there are a couple of setbacks that we're experiencing, and one is not having enough sediment to do that work, and the other is not necessarily having enough funding to do that work. So we're primed to have these large projects on the line, but we're waiting for a couple of things to fill out that process.
So this idea of restoring marshes in the Bay, it actually goes back decades, and some of the work has been going on over an extended time. But that was before climate change was even really on our radar screen and sea level rise. So why is this marsh restoration such an important opportunity with climate change now really arriving and having an impact today?
Yeah, I think that's correct in that we weren't thinking as much about climate change. I think we were aware, but not really using it in our planning over 30 or so years ago. But a number of recent reports, the Balin's Goals Habitat Update and the Adaptation Atlas that were recently produced, really help us understand the need to do this work now. A lot of our infrastructure is built along the shoreline of the Bay. And with sea level rise, that infrastructure and people's homes are threatened. Some of these tidal marsh projects actually will be located or are located in front of some of that infrastructure. And so the sooner that we can restore some of these areas, I think the more protection we'll be able to provide both those businesses and people.
So the pace of tidal marsh restoration in the Bay has really picked up in the last few years. And it seems like that's both because there's more funding and also more people getting involved and actually volunteering to help. Is that right?
I think it's true, and I think there's more awareness. I know a lot of cities and counties are actually starting to take climate adaptation planning into consideration. Hayward Shoreline, for example, has been doing some work to plan for sea level rise in the future, as well as San Mateo County. So I think as people become more aware, I think it's hopeful in that we'll be able to do more a little more quickly.
Yeah, I was really encouraged to see that Hayward's shoreline plan actually calls for the most tidal marsh restoration possible, not just to benefit the Bay, but also to protect all the development along the shoreline. Yeah. Jesse, are there other places you've been impressed with that are really embracing this need to adapt the shoreline?
Yeah, I think that, tidal marsh and tidal mudflat habitats weren't always valued in the way that they are now. I think people are realizing the value that they play in the Bay Area. We live on the Pacific Flyway. We get a ton of beautiful migratory birds every winter. I know that birding has become more popular during COVID as a safe activity. And I think that, as Donna said, communities and counties are also starting to think about really smart planning for the future and how they can sort of nip it in the bud. So something I always think about because of a project that Save the Bay worked on is the way that sanitary districts and wastewater treatment plants are starting to think about adapting to sea level rise. In the case of sea level rise, that could have major impacts, not just on the shoreline, but all the way inland, up the watershed, in the services that they provide to people. And
You
there are
mean
some.
we might not be able to flush
Yes.
if the sewage treatment plants are being flooded because of sea level rise?
I think that's something we take for granted, and there are some wastewater treatment plants, sewage plants around the bay that are actively thinking about sea level rise in the future. Some examples are the city of Palo Alto, the city of Menlo Park, and then in the case of the project that Save the Bay worked on, Ora Loma, the San Lorenzo wastewater treatment plant. And they're really trying to think about how they can adapt to sea level rise so that those impacts aren't as catastrophic.
Yeah. So these are some of the places where this innovation in climate adaptation, kind of green infrastructure, is really being practiced. And it's described as a horizontal levee. Could you explain more about what that really means?
Horizontal levee, there's a lot of names for that people are using right now. Horizontal levee, living levee, ecotone levee. But basically, it's the space between the tidal marsh, or the marsh that gets inundated, and the uplands. And it's a really critical area for a lot of plants and animals, but also provides a space between that flooding that we talked about earlier, where it might help buffer some of that flooding or buffer some of the impacts coming from runoff upstream. But I want to jump back to something Jesse said. I just want to really address this issue of COVID and people using the shoreline. I think it provides a really great opportunity for us to continue to educate people. I know I live along the Richmond shoreline, and I would say that the use of the shoreline has tripled since COVID. And I think it is an opportunity for those of us who want to fund this work and help protect the shoreline to really reach out to those people and educate people on the value of both the habitat as well as the function that we get from, protecting against things like sea level rise.
Yeah, it does seem like the bay is actually its best advertisement if you can just get people to the shoreline,
Right.
Who may take for granted that we live so close to this amazing natural asset. Just seeing the bay and experiencing it and bringing people to it who haven't on the Bay Trail and in these natural areas has a huge impact.
Yeah, I think for some has been sort of a out there idea, that there's animals out there that use it or birds that use it. And I think you explained it so well. We're on the Pacific Flyway. It's a really important part of habitats along the whole West Coast. And so to be able to have people really appreciate it and then do the work that Save the Bay and others are doing to help restore is important.
Yeah, and I think that people's minds are changing, and we're seeing that with the way that they're voting, too. I think people are thinking critically about the value of tidal marsh and also about the impacts to sea level rise. For example, Measure AA in 2016. That was a 9-county parcel tax. People don't often like to vote for additional taxes, and they did. That sets aside $500 million over the course of 20 years for bay restoration and recreation around the bay, improving bay trails so people can get out and bike. And then, let's see, San Francisco voting for a bond to improve the seawall because horizontal levees are not always the right solution for, like I said, a heavily industrialized, urbanized
with
Bay
deep
Area.
water right offshore.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that people are really starting to wake up to the threat of sea level rise in our small community.
Yeah.
And I think our leaders, as well as our representatives, are starting to take note of that people are noticing the value of our shorelines and the value of these not only habitats, but also then the threats to our infrastructure. And so I know that there are measures in the legislature right now that people are taking up to try to address some of these issues.
Yeah, I like these examples where people are really responsible for this renaissance, this turning of the tide, because people were responsible for the destruction of the bay and the damage to the bay. So it's kind of a reawakening. Can you say more about the opportunity for people to get involved, especially on these horizontal levees, because you've really helped engage a lot of people to do that work?
Yeah, Save the Bay has a great network of volunteers that actively get involved with the restoration we do. So that means like coming out to the shoreline and helping us plant. There are very large-scale projects on the line, tens of thousands of acres of tidal marsh, and some of that work can't be done without additional help. So we get our work done with a network of over 6,000 volunteers, and those are people that really care about these habitats and really care about having beautiful places to recreate and to see animals and birds.
So in the midst of all this renaissance of tidal marsh, there still are some communities that are considering construction at sea level rise. It would really be at risk.
Yeah, not everyone's forward thinking in this way. Cargill, for example, is trying to develop on the Redwood City salt ponds. And that's a tough situation for us because it's right next to the Don Edwards National Wildlife Refuge. There's no reason why that couldn't be included and create a larger contiguous swath of habitat. And that's not the only example of these fumblings that counties and cities occasionally make. But for the most part, I really believe that the Bay Area is moving forward thinking about sea level rise adaptation.
It underscores the need for a regional plan that will help these areas that are falling behind in the race to adapt the shoreline to really catch up.
I think that one benefit or good thing that's really happening is we're starting to get a lot of really good science that can support that planning if that planning moves forward. Jesse mentioned the Sediment for Survival report that SFEI put out. There's an adaptation atlas, the Baylands Goals update. I think we really are gaining the knowledge that we need to move these projects forward. I think it's just bringing the public along with us.
Yeah. Well, in some ways, I think the public is actually ahead of the decision makers and the regulators. And you see that in the work that's being done. And yet we have these institutions that need to catch up and help the communities that don't have the resources to do this work to do more of that. I want to thank you both for this conversation and all that you've contributed. I think it's really clear there's a lot of excellent progress being made in response to climate change, and we still have a lot of work to do and some big challenges, including enough funding to do this work, some improved regulation and encouragement from the regional agencies to make this happen faster, and then really to not leave communities behind that are most at risk and have suffered the most from environmental injustice over the years. So thank you both for being with me.
Yeah, thanks for having me as well. I'm feeling really hopeful.
The work that Save the Bay has done over the last 60 years has really helped in this discussion and really helped push things along. So thanks, Save the Bay, too.
Thank you.
I'm Dinesh Nirmal, General Manager of IBM Automation, and I'm thrilled that IBM is serving as a sponsor for the Save the Bay 60th anniversary. IBM's presence in the Bay Area dates to the 1950s, and over the years, thousands of IBM employees have supported efforts to collaborate with the partners in the community to protect and preserve the local environment.
My team has helped champion IBM's sponsorship of Save the Bay and Bay Day for the past several years. We are excited to continue the partnership in 2021. Our partnership with Save the Bay has been a great opportunity for our team to work together to restore and protect the San Francisco Bay.
Bay Area is home to some of the most beautiful terrain, and IBM looks forward to working together with Save the Bay for many years to come. Thank you.
Now we want to welcome Suresh Raman, who is on the board of Save the Bay and has been volunteering since 2005. In his spare time, he is the director of software development at eBay, but I know you like to spend most of your time getting your hands dirty along the shoreline.
Of course.
I know Save the Bay is targeting 100,000 acres of tidal marsh to keep San Francisco Bay healthy. Tell us about why timing is important in doing that work. Time is crucial.
Yes, Wendy, it's sad. We had 400,000 acres of pristine wetlands here, and that would have been adequate protection against sea level rise. But we destroyed 90% of them, and now we're trying to return or restore 100,000 acres for a reasonably healthy Bay Area. Mm-hmm. And we're running against time because wetland restoration is a long process. It takes about 10 to 20 years to have a healthy tidal marsh. And we probably only have that much time before rising seas, storm surges, coastal flooding, king tides start to become a major problem for us. This is why we need to do this with urgency, and we need a lot of funding to start our restoration work on all the 100,000 acres.
And that's why funds are very important right now as well.
Right. This is one of the biggest reasons I donate generously to Save the Bay, and I urge our listeners to do the same today.
Tell us what you like about restoration work and working with other volunteers.
Sure. I like working on the ground, getting my hands dirty, pulling weeds and planting. It's a way of getting close to nature, like reading a book. So as a solo activity, it's already very therapeutic. When I go out on the bay to volunteer with others, just seeing everybody who is of like mind, we all have a purpose, we're all there believing in a healthy bay, and we're working towards it, that's very satisfying. And occasionally we go back and visit the same site, we volunteer at the same site, and you can see the progress we have made in restoring the wetland.
That makes it really gratifying, doesn't it, to see the impact of your work?
Right.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your generosity, and thank you for being with us today.
You're welcome, Wendy.
Look at the habitat around me. Notice differences between this side and this side? This area here is the tidal marsh, and specifically the intertidal zone. And in this area, it looks so different because this is where the tides inundate and then uncover parts of the marshes. So it's predominantly pickleweed, but when you look at this side here, this is what we call the transition zone. And this is where Save the Bay focuses our restoration work.
Hello, my name is Anukia, and this is my poem, If the Water Rises and There Is No More. Last year, the California State Legislative Analyst's Office released a statement saying that if no action were to be taken, the San Francisco Bay would be completely flooded by 2100 due to climate change. And I think a lot about that statement. I think a lot about the irony of a California that has no San Francisco Bay. So 80 years from today, if the water rises and there is no more, I would tell my granddaughter about the bay. If the water rises and there is no more, I think I would start off with history. I'd tell my granddaughter about 1769, how the first immigrants came to California, spending days treading the sea line just to find a safe place to dock. I'd tell her how the San Francisco Bay ended up being the only soft thing they could find along California's 840-mile shoreline. How since then, millions of workers, immigrants, and families have tumbled into the bay's warm embrace. If the water rises and there is no more, I would tell my granddaughter about the bay's benevolent rage. I would tell her about the day the sky turned orange and ash lingered through San Francisco like an omen. I'd tell her about how thousands of wetland creatures steeled themselves against the bay's heavy womb, how the bay thrashed back with the rage of a sky full of matriarchs, which is to say that I think the bay is something like a mother, beckoning and selfless, swelling with over 70% of California's marshland, carving homes and communities and livelihoods out of the mud of her own body. I tell my granddaughter about how the bay is like a song, how staring across the expanse can make you feel so small, yet so endless and undying. In the best case scenario of this poem, my granddaughter is rolling her eyes and telling me how much of a bore I am. I don't tolerate disrespect, but I'd rather her bored and flippant than starry-eyed and entranced at my descriptions. I don't want her to let me finish the poem. I want her to cut me off and say, I've seen this before, because it at least means that the bay is still here. And in the end of the poem, I think that's all I really want, to know that we've done enough to save our home.
That is the perfect way for us to move to our second panel now, to talk about the lands and the waterways upstream from the bay and the challenges we face from drought, wildfire, and pollution. Once again, here's David with our panel.
Good morning and welcome back for this conversation about how climate change is affecting the Bay and Bay Area. I'm David Lewis, the Executive Director at Save the Bay. And I want to welcome a great set of panelists that we have with us. Josh Bratt is a watershed specialist at the San Francisco Estuary Partnership. Amanda Brown Stevens is the Executive Director of the Greenbelt Alliance, and Allison Chan is the Political Director at Save the Bay. Welcome, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we heard earlier about the many ways that climate change is affecting the Bay Area, and we talked quite a bit about sea level rise on the shoreline. So people maybe don't think about how when we live away from the shoreline, we're still actually related to the bay because we're living in watersheds. Can you explain a little bit about how cities are connected to the bay and these impacts, climate impacts, are connected?
Well, we know that there are going to be more intense, concentrated storm events that will unleash a lot more water at one time, and that's going to overwhelm our current storm drain systems, which are undersized based on the development that has come in after they've been built. It also will impact streams. If you have a lot of water being concentrated and discharged into a stream at any one time, you're going to get a lot of erosion. And a lot more pollution right into those streams, impacting habitats. Folks who live along the creeks, if they have erosion on their stream banks, either they're going to lose some of their property or they're going to take some measures that will push the erosion to somebody else. So those are the things that do happen. We're also looking at increased heat, and so wildfires and urban heat islands are going to be impacting communities quite a bit, and that's a big health risk.
So climate change is affecting some parts of the Bay Area more than others. Can you say something, Amanda and then Josh, about how these impacts are felt differently by different communities? Who's going to feel the most extreme impacts?
That's a great question. I think, unfortunately, like many of the worst impacts of the challenges we have as a society, often communities that are already vulnerable feel the impacts first and feel the impacts more extremely. For example, areas along the shoreline with high flood risk tend to be also areas in the Bay Area with industrial and other pollution, and areas where there's more housing for low-income communities. And that's a place where there are also cities that are strapped with multiple challenges and have fewer resources to build the infrastructure that protects those communities.
So climate change in cities, just as on the shoreline, there's an environmental justice aspect to this too, and really a different impact that relates to equity in the Bay Area. Is that right?
Definitely. That's something that we're all going to be struggling with for a long time on how to deal with that issue, where right now, I believe that the focus is really on trying to adapt the shorelines to protect these vulnerable communities that are on the waterfront, the frontline communities. But I think, we can only count on that for so long. There is no end stage to sea level rise projections that I'm seeing. And eventually, communities that are down low topography, close to sea level, are going to have to move, very likely. And how are we as a society going to equitably keep communities intact, or will we just let folks migrate individually, probably away from California, period?
I think it's also important to remember that many of these communities that we're talking about already experience climate impacts. For example, neighborhoods of East Palo Alto that have been flooding regularly for decades. And part of that is because the climate has been already changing for quite some time, but part of it has been this underinvestment in their public services, like storm drain systems, that have left them vulnerable. And those vulnerabilities, like Amanda said, are going to be exacerbated. So what we can do is learn from some of these communities that have already been experiencing these challenges, prioritize them for protections, but also learn from that to think about how we're going to protect other communities that are at risk of these impacts and haven't yet experienced them to that degree.
We heard earlier about some of the natural solutions that use nature as part of the infrastructure on the shoreline for addressing sea level rise and climate impacts. Are there also green solutions available in cities, and are there some examples that you're seeing of cities really taking this into account?
I'll take that one and say that cities who are part of the what's called the municipal regional permit, which is big words for they discharge stormwater either to creeks or to the bay. They are regulated, and they've been told by the water board that they need to create watershed-based green infrastructure plans. And green infrastructure is the use of landscaping to slow down runoff, to absorb runoff, filter it before that water goes from underground piping into the storm drain system. And so most of the cities have got master plans for green infrastructure, to deploy green infrastructure, and now it's, do they have the resources to actually make these dreams come true?
Josh, have you seen a particular project that's an actual example? Can you describe what green infrastructure means in a street someplace in the Bay Area?
Well, I've been managing a project for about 10 years now to do some retrofit green infrastructure projects on San Pablo Avenue, which is a major thoroughfare in the East Bay. We have 4 installations now that treat 6 acres of stormwater runoff. They are in the cities of Oakland, Emeryville, Berkeley, and El Cerrito. And you can see them if you just drive up and down the road.
Another great example of green infrastructure that already exists in our communities is right at Lake Merritt, an iconic location where people in Oakland and from other areas come to be outside and enjoy and walk around and frequent businesses. And the city of Oakland was able to find funding to not only add urban greening elements, green infrastructure elements that help to clean stormwater before it flows into the lake, but also to combine that with a whole overhaul of the streets surrounding one part of the lake to better accommodate pedestrians and people on bikes.
So urban greening has multiple benefits. We're talking about climate change as the driver, but can you list some of the benefits from these urban greening solutions? Yeah,
urban greening is a wonderful multi-benefit solution because it provides so many amenities to the community. In addition to being a solution to some of these environmental problems we're talking about, like water quality or flooding, one of the other issues that our communities are dealing with, and a great example of that is what we dealt with last fall, is extreme heat. When we had the wildfires, it was also extremely hot outside, and many people were stuck indoors without air conditioning. If you have urban greening in those areas, the temperatures will actually be lower. And not only that, urban greening provides an incentive for people to get out of their house and recreate outdoors, walk more, bike more, instead of getting in their cars. That's good for public health, that's good for the environment, and it's better for quality of life.
So urban greening seems like a no-brainer for cities to provide all these benefits to people who live there and accommodate the growth that you said is coming to the Bay Area. What are some of the big challenges? Is it just inertia and old ways of thinking, or is it lack of funding for these solutions, or is it both?
In government processes and planning processes in the Bay Area, we tend to think slower is better. And that's a problem when we're thinking about how we're taking on climate change. We have some huge opportunities particularly in some redevelopment of big areas, places like Moffett Park and Sunnyvale. The city wants to do the right thing. They're excited about creating what they're calling eco-innovation districts, where they'll be able to provide homes, provide green space, create areas that reduce flood risk because it is near the shoreline. And I think there's a lot of momentum, but there also are barriers in process and then in funding. After many years of nothing but headaches and problems from the administration in Washington, we now have a huge opportunity. We have support at the federal government. We have the potential for funding. We have an administration that cares about climate change. And we have an administration that's talking about building back better. When I think about that, I think about not just building the infrastructure we need the way we have in the past, but how are we building the infrastructure for the future? How are we investing in infrastructure in a way that is bringing in those nature-based solutions, bringing in nature where we can, and adapting to what we know the flood risk is going to look like, what we know the drought and fire risk is going to look like moving forward. How do we build in more uncertainty, because that's a challenge, and how do we invest?
So can you give an example, maybe some examples, who in the Bay Area, what communities and leaders are taking this seriously with the urgency, and what are some examples of what's being done that is really making a difference?
I think at the local level in the Bay Area, there are cities and counties that are starting to think in a really serious way about incorporating climate resilience. One city that we've been working with a lot, the city of San Jose, is starting to realize that climate resilience, and in particular urban greening, can't be the job of one department. Can't be the job of two people working in a department whose job it is to protect the local environment in San Jose. It has to bring together departments from throughout the city and essentially has to be a citywide priority.
Josh, you wanted to add to that.
You know, in my practice, I've found that one of the stumbling blocks really is coordinating with the utilities themselves, who are not ready to interact with green infrastructure. They would rather replace concrete for concrete rather than a living system for a living system if they have to access it. So I think those kinds of changes need to be made. We have to bring the utilities on board for them to embrace this new approach. And also schools. I think schools are real opportunity zones for green infrastructure. They've got a lot of space. They even have a labor force that is on site with the students who could be stewarding these kinds of approaches on their campuses.
So I really like that point that a lot of these opportunities at scale are on public property. Streets that cities are responsible for, schools you mentioned, utility corridors. And that's actually within a city's control, potentially, or a school district's control to decide what they do on that land that can actually be more green.
Thinking about the public infrastructure we have and not to be cliched, but breaking down silos. I think the school piece is so interesting because one thing that schools are is it's a network of places that are spaced really well across communities because they're gathering spaces for students. When we think about climate change and adaptation, one of the components is disaster preparedness because we know these disasters are coming. And if we coordinate between adaptation and planning and how we're reducing our risk with preparing for how we bounce back in the face of these inevitable disasters.
Well, and especially as we know, the underserved communities have the least access to nature, even urban parks and green spaces. So is there an opportunity with this work to put an emphasis on those communities that are the farthest behind and maybe put them to the front of the list to receive this kind of attention?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the first thing to do would be to go into those communities and ask them what they want and need. You know, I think there are a million ways where we could integrate climate resilience with public amenities that are badly needed, but we shouldn't be the ones making those decisions. So I think the first step is having truly inclusive planning processes within these communities to say, what is it that you all need? We're here to talk a little bit about climate resilience. We know that there are ways in which some of the solutions we're thinking about could provide other services for this community. Does that match your expectations and needs? And I think that's when you have solutions that are sustainable.
You know, there's so much progressive thinking here in the Bay Area, understanding of climate change, and frankly, wealth. It seems like we actually have an opportunity to act regionally on climate impacts, maybe more than other places. Would you say that's true?
I think there's more we need to do to connect the dots for people, to help people understand. For some people, it feels like, what can we do at a local level? And so we can connect the dots and show we can actually come together if we are planning as a region, if we're investing as a region, we're both protecting, all of us protecting our most vulnerable communities. And we're seeing that we see now what happens to our neighbors happens to us. We smell the smoke. We have that negative impact, even if our city's not burning. If floods happen, floods don't stop at city boundaries. So we need to be thinking collectively. And I do think we can, but we're not there yet.
So it's clear we have enormous challenges inland and upstream to adapt to climate change, make the Bay Area livable and sustainable in the face of all these challenges. But I also heard a lot of hopeful themes about breaking down silos and leaders who are stepping up to help bring the new thinking, new methods, and new funding to this effort throughout the Bay Area. And I really want to thank all of you for the work that you're doing and for helping educate everyone about these challenges and opportunities. They're not just along the shoreline of the Bay, they're in our cities, and they're really connected.
Well, I grew up inland. I grew up in San Jose. And every time I got to see the Bay, it just made me feel good. And what I saw in San Jose when I was a kid was a lot of development, just plowing over open space and plowing over orchards and pasture lands. And to build homes and shopping centers and stuff that was inefficiently developed. You know, the land was not used efficiently, and it was built around the car. And I knew that. I watched it. I watched it all go away as from a child to now. You know, I'm in my middle age, and what we have left is become very precious. And I feel it very deeply that we all need to contribute to help preserve these precious spaces, whether they be at the bay or whether they be farther up in the watershed. If you have nature in your backyard, you need to protect it.
Joining me now is Terry Young, who is on the board with Save the Bay. And Terry is a scientist who has spent her whole career doing environmental work. Why did you choose this particular organization to get involved with?
When I left my regulatory position, I wanted to stay involved in protecting the Bay. And looking at all of the organizations that I was familiar with after working on these issues for 30 years, Save the Bay came right to the top. And the reason for that is that, in my view, they're working on the most important issues, and they are very, very effective at what they do, getting results.
Tell me some of the things that Save the Bay is doing that you feel are important.
Save the Bay is continuing to be one of the most effective organizations there is out there in continuing to promote shoreline restoration and wetlands restoration. And the second is working on what's called green infrastructure inland. If you want to protect the Bay from the effects of climate change, what you want to do are bayside restoration and move inland and promote green infrastructure. If you want to protect the Bay Area communities, you do the same two things. So it's all connected.
It's kind of a win-win thing.
Absolutely.
So all of this work is expensive.
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking a lot of money. So tell me a little bit about that and what Save the Bay is up against in terms of raising that kind of money.
It is expensive. So a lot of what Save the Bay is doing is to show people what a wise investment it is in the future, both in terms of creating resilience against climate change and in creating more livable cities. It's a very effective organization with a very small staff, but we still do need funding, and we hope that people are motivated to help us out.
To help out. Well, thank you for that work.
You are very welcome. Thank you for helping us.
I'm delighted to be here today.
There's a particularly large spring tide that happens 1 to 2 times every year, and it's called a king tide. King tides are like a snapshot of the future, and it's super important when we plan our cities to use king tides to help us plan for what the Bay might look like in the future. We know that the sea level is rising as a result of human-caused climate change. king tide now can give us a snapshot of what a regular high tide might look like in 50 years.
We've all learned a lot today, but the most important point is that it's not too late to turn the tide on climate change. Here are some messages now from some others, including California's Secretary of Natural Resources, Wade Crowfoot. Some thoughts on how we can come together and make a difference for our environment and the Bay.
I'm Wade Crowfoot, California Natural Resources Secretary and former volunteer at Save the Bay, here to wish this organization a happy 60th birthday. For the last 6 decades, Save the Bay has been leading the charge, protecting, conserving, and restoring this incredible natural feature we know as the San Francisco Bay. Over 20 years ago, I had an opportunity to begin working with Save the Bay, protecting the Bay from a disastrous proposal to expand the San Francisco airport into the Bay. And later, I came to volunteer on the board of Save the Bay. Now, moving forward, Save the Bay's role is more important than ever, particularly building climate resilience, protecting people and nature from the impacts of climate change. Your leadership spearheading massive wetland restoration will be a critical natural buffer to the extreme weather we know is worsening as a result of climate change.
I've been volunteering with Save the Bay for 15 years, and I've done pretty much everything there is to do. It's been amazing to me. You add some water and the plants come back, the seeds float in, the animals come in. I know when Eden Landing started being restored, it was pretty barren and pretty depressing. And as soon as they did some remodeling, and it's incredible. It's such a beautiful place now. It's just amazing.
We want the natural habitat for all the animals and the birds. So it's important that we, work towards saving the Bay and making it beautiful and restoring it.
I'm optimistic because we know what we need to do to combat climate change, and solutions like wetlands restoration are the key to actually achieving resilience while sequestering and reducing pollution.
I'm always looking forward to new restoration projects, but I'm also really excited to see especially younger people seem focused on a lot of the things that need to change.
It's important that we teach our children now so that next generation realizes how important it is to be aware of our situation of global warming and work towards reducing the harm that we are already doing.
As we conclude our program, it's an opportunity for each of us to pledge to ourselves and to each other what we will do to protect the San Francisco Bay. I pledge in my role to ensure that we're using taxpayer resources and the legal authorities we have to find innovative solutions to restore the environmental habitats on the San Francisco Bay and build climate resilience in the San Francisco Bay in partnership with Save the Bay.
I will do everything I can to help ensure a cleaner and healthier Bay for my daughter and my kids and future generations.
I will commit to working on anything political that gets more funding for restoration.
I will make sustainable choices in my daily life.
I will educate and inspire future generations to become Bay stewards.
I will work towards helping my school become a more environmentally aware and friendly community.
I will make sustainable choices in my daily life and continue to support Save the Bay.
I will continue to spread environmental awareness to youth like me.
I will appreciate and work to protect the beautiful treasure that is our San Francisco Bay.
We want to thank everyone who made this event possible. David Lewis and the staff and the volunteers with Save the Bay, our event sponsors for their continued support, our panelists for the important work they do, and all of you for your interest and your time. You are the solution. 60 years ago, Sylvia McLaughlin, Kay Kerr, and Esther Gulick got the ball rolling. And now, it's our turn. Please support Save the Bay at whatever level you can. So let's do it. Let's save the bay. Thanks for joining us, and take care.